Right, good afternoon then, folks, as we head into US trading on Monday, the 17th of July. We'll get stuck into markets, we'll see what's going on, and a relatively quiet start to the week, which is not out of the ordinary considering it is Monday. You can see across the headlines, global shares dip after Chinese data, traders bet on Fed sea change, a little bit of downside in stocks or a little bit of negativity in markets over the course of this morning after some weaker than expected Chinese GDP figures this morning. We'll have a look at that as we come across to the calendar, but oil down slightly off the back of that as well. US dollar obviously had a massive downside last week. Big, the largest weekly loss in the price of the US dollar since the year began. So markets probably, or certainly the US dollar anyway, probably wants a bit of a bounce back, looking to recoup some of the losses from last week. So a bit of a bounce back in the dollar will not be unexpected to start the week, and is probably what you would expect. Now we've got a few things to look at over the course of this week, mainly into next week, but earnings season has kicked off. Haven't had many of the major names out just yet. We are still awaiting earnings reports from those larger companies, but as they start to roll in over the course of this week and into next week mainly, do we see some weak earnings reports, and does that fuel a bit of negativity in stocks? Obviously, with a large upside in stocks last week, and substantial downside in the dollar with interest rates being priced out, or interest rate hikes being priced out coming into that November meeting a little bit later on in the year due to some lower than expected inflation prints last week. So inflation continues in the right direction. The disinflation story continues to be a theme in markets. That provided markets with some upside last week. Obviously, after you see some aggressive upside in stocks, naturally a bit of downside is to be expected. Flip side with the dollar, large downside in the dollar, actually a bit of a pullback is to be expected. So that's the kind of thoughts on markets as we start the week. Maybe a bit of a pullback from last week. Bit of negativity surrounding China gives markets a slight bit of a reason to go about that. You can see downside in stocks over we got across here on the left. Slight bit of downside across US equity futures, but certainly European equity futures down across the board. You can see the 1 week percentage change, so against stocks or for stocks higher across the board. So again, a bit of downside, a bit of negativity in them is not to be unexpected. You can see bond yields slightly lower, obviously due to the fact that the Chinese data came in weak, down a little bit off the back of some potential growth concerns relating to the global economy. We have seen a little bit of a bounce back in recent trade, so not too much to see there in terms of the bond yield picture. You can see the US dollar pretty green across the board, apart from against the Canadian dollar, Swiss franc, and the Norwegian krone, which are basically flat across those different currencies. So positive dollars today, kind of going in line with that expected bounce back in the price of it. You can see the Australian dollar, Kiwi dollar down in line with the stock indexes and with that Chinese growth, or negative print, or not a negative print, a miss on consensus for that Chinese GDP figures, or those Chinese GDP figures over the course of this morning. Rest of FX pretty mixed. You can see Canadian dollar, euro, sterling, and the Japanese yen slightly mixed. The Japanese yen had a good week of it last week. Dollar yen is down at 138. 138, 139, so a pretty solid bounce back since that rejection of 145 that we have talked about in many recent videos. Swiss franc slightly higher, but nothing too major when it comes to FX land to start the week. We'll come back to the calendar, and as you can see, GDP figures missing consensus by a full percent in terms of the yearly figure. A few mixed numbers when it comes to the rest of them, but the headline figure, the GDP growth rate over the course of the last year, or in relation to Q2 of last year, still 6.3 is pretty strong growth, kind of in line with Chinese expectations, but not as strong as anticipated. Obviously, this time last year, you still had COVID measures in place. You're coming out of COVID measures, so that size of an increase in the economy in the space of the year, the Chinese probably would have hoped for a little bit more than that, which is why they are targeting certain sectors of the economy in order to prop up and boost growth within that economy. So something to keep an eye on is that Chinese economy over the coming weeks ahead, but negative figures this morning causing some negativity in markets. And you can see the Australian dollar, Kiwi dollar trying to push the fresh lows It's dollar yen trying to push the fresh highs, a bit of strength in the US dollar, likely to due to the fact that these bond yields are making a slight attempt higher. But euro dollar cable pretty sideways. Cable, boy, is still slightly lower, as you can see here over the course of Friday and into today. Those UK inflation figures, which we'll touch on in a later video, do come into focus on Wednesday at 7 a.m. Dollar CAD not doing much. The dollar index, yeah, I mean, you have to imagine potentially some sort of retracement back up to this 101 level up here would make a bit of sense if you were to start popping higher, although you would want to see it breaking through these near-term highs, certainly on the hourly time frame, which we are testing now. Obviously, we are 35 minutes away from US trade for the day. Let's see if we can get some upside on the US dollar, which does mean I think dollar yen's in focus, a little bit of an inverse head and shoulders if you are that way inclined. Does that get a pop up through 139? The figure, let's see, it's obviously had substantial losses over the course of the last few trading sessions or last few days. Let's see if that can play out and give us a bit of a bounce back up towards maybe 140, 141 in that kind of region. In around there would make sense for a bit of a pullback, but certainly a technical trade keep an eye on over the course of today's US session. If that does pop higher, should spark a bit of a move higher back towards 140, 141 on dollar yen. But apart from that, not a great deal of movement. You want, in order to kind of confirm US dollar strength, you want euro dollar to get moving a bit lower again. If you're slightly technically inclined, there's a bit of a rising wedge at the top of a trend, which some people will choose to draw. You get that on for yourself. Maybe that could spark a little bit of downside for us. Certainly after such an aggressive run, a bit of downside would not be unexpected. Apart from that, if we flick across to the stock indexes, pretty sideways across the board. You can see the S&P, the Dow Jones, the Nasdaq and the Russell not really offering much fresh impetus. You can see the DAX slightly lower, the FTSE pretty sideways, Nikkei pretty sideways. Again, a lack of direction across the board to start the trading week. You can see 10-year yields across the US, Germany and the UK all pretty sideways. You can see 2-year yields across the board pretty sideways, and really a lack of direction as we head into US trade. But in terms of my point of view, I'd probably hope for a bit of dollar upside, given a bit of a reason for some dollar upside, or I would say a bit more of an excuse for some dollar upside, is this Empire State Manufacturing Index that came out not so long ago, about half an hour ago, that beat consensus up to 1.1. So has sparked a little bit of upside in the US dollar. Kind of goes in line with a bit of negativity from China. Positive US figures has sparked a tiny bit of upside in the US dollar, which goes in line with maybe hoping for a bit of a pullback after the substantial losses that we had last week. So maybe a bit of a bounce back in the dollar to continue. That's what I would hope for in today's US session, but not a great deal of price action to work with across the board. A couple of things we're keeping an eye on, maybe some euro dollar, maybe some dollar yen, a couple of charts that we looked at. Really, you'll be waiting for those US to kick things into gear in about half an hour's time.